Okay, we are recording.
So, welcome everyone. I'm Leslie Orloff. I direct the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University Washington College of Law, and I want to welcome you all here for this training. As we get started, and Laura will help me with this a bit as well, if you I really do want to create an opportunity for you to ask questions as we go. And so if you want to ask a question and you can put yourself on camera, raise your hand, and then Gwen and Laura will be watching and draw my attention to that, and I'll be watching too, to be able to call on you. Is there another way to raise your hand other than being on camera? Laura, do you know?
I do not believe there is, Leslie. So
Okay.
if anybody does not have camera capability, then just please put a note in the chat, and we'll be, monitoring that too.
Right, and you should feel free if you have questions as I'm speaking, either raise your hand or type them in the chat. And if in fact, let's say there's more questions in the chat than we're able to get to today, we're going to follow up as we go through this with further materials and information afterwards. So we will get you answers if I wasn't able to anything I wasn't able to get to while we're online here. So welcome everyone. We're going to be talking about best practices in serving immigrant victims. And as I said, I'm Leslie Orloff. Just a little background. I run the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University Washington College of Law. We provide training and technical assistance nationally on a whole range of issues and our goal is to support service providers of all kinds and backgrounds who are encountering or may encounter immigrant survivors in their work. And so survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, child neglect, human trafficking, and the like. By the end of this webinar, our goal is that you'll be better able to understand some of the special dynamics and barriers that immigrant survivors encounter, be familiar with the range of protections that immigrant survivors of domestic and sexual violence are eligible to access, and child abuse victims as well, and know how to assist survivors in accessing identifying what public benefits and services immigrants victims are eligible for, and help them be able to access those services in a trauma-informed way.
Leslie, could you share your screen with us?
I didn't do that?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, you know what? Right. So because we had to leave, I probably have to go back and give her permission again. Let me do that. Okay. Sorry. Leslie, let me see. Right click. Make you the presenter. Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Okay. And then I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. I think. It's telling me it's still got an X through it.
It just made you the presenter, and it shows that you're the presenter.
I'm clicking the screen share button and nothing's happening. Hold on, let me get out of the presentation maybe. And then I'll go to...
Sorry, everybody. We practiced this, so it's just there's glitches, but we'll get it.
I think I found it. Now
there you go.
Okay,
that's right.
Now I've lost the other thing I was doing. Hold on. Okay, I can see everybody now. Okay. So now you can see my screen. We're all good, Gwen? Okay. And you can hear me hopefully, but why isn't the screen switching? One sec. There we go. Okay. Just to get a sense of who's on the call, could you type in the chat, like what your background is, like what your professional background is. And maybe Gwen, you can tell me what people are seeing, because I don't, let me see. Oh, I can see the chat.
Yeah, no problem.
So just to get an idea of who's on the line with us.
Well, I know Gwen's going to do this, but let me throw in. So we've got Christine Irene, and I don't know who I is. It says and I, but we've got 4 people, or at least from the center. We've got a couple of our court advocates. We got our crisis program manager. We've got one of our attorneys, our case manager. Yeah, that looks like a couple of our attorneys. Sorry. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay. It's good to know. Just get my. So what we're going to do is start with demographics, and maybe you could, again, use the chat to type in what you're seeing. Where are you, of the immigrant survivors you may have encountered in your work thus far, where are they coming from? Where are you seeing people coming from? What countries? And if you want to unmute yourselves and just talk, that would be great too. Anybody? Laura, you want to lead us off?
Sure. So we help people in Calvert, Charles, and St. Mary's County, and our immigrant victims have come from China, Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico, the Ukraine. I see one of our people answered that. Thank you, because I didn't know the answer for sure. And then I know we've got a couple other people who we didn't mention. So we have somebody, Karen is here from the Pregnancy Resource Center and does advocacy for mothers and families. And Paige is here from the Catherine Foundation Pregnancy Resource Center. Oh, and Nicole is here from, oops, my chat just went up. And some victim advocates, it says, that's Erica and Nicole. Okay,
Wonderful.
sorry. Yeah. From the Center for Abused Persons, which is in Charles.
So what we have to start off for you guys is some demographics on Maryland. 15% of the state's population are foreign-born. Of that, about 44% are naturalized citizens. Another 25% are lawful permanent residents. And then about 30% are this group of people that I like, the way we think about them, they're the immigrants where status can make them at risk or make them more vulnerable. And that's because they might be here on a temporary visa with no path to lawful permanent residency. Those are your work visa, your diplomatic visa holders, student visa holders. There could be a number of different, visitor visa holders. I mean, there's lots of different visas, but they're here legally. Then there's people who are also undocumented. And then there are people like the immigrant victims we're going to be talking about today who are, as a matter of law, undocumented, but have some protections because they're on a path towards legal status based on their victimization. And you've seen, Maryland has seen a 76% rise in the immigrant population in the last couple of decades. 19% of people in Maryland speak a language other than English at home, and 37% of those people are limited English proficient. And you also have a population where about 25% of the immigrant population in the state entered the country fairly recently after 2010. About 30% of the children in the state of Maryland have one or more foreign-born parents, and of children who live in families with one or more immigrant parents, 87.5% of them in the state are, I'm presenting at a webinar. Okay, my husband's serving me tea, thank you. You're on camera. In the state are citizens. In your counties, the demographics look a little more like this, and I'm sorry about how small the slide was, but we have a document that we're going to distribute to you, and Gwen, I want to make sure this is on the webpage and in the follow-up email. Gwen did this work, and basically in Calvert County, the immigrant population is 2.9%. In Charles, it's 6%. And in St. Mary's, it's 4.8%. And you can see that in all of them, in St. Mary's has the largest percentage of that population that are not citizens. Whereas in Calvert and Charles, you have about 60%, over 60% or more of the foreign-born population are actually now naturalized citizens. And that you can see that your demographics in your counties, Asian countries of origin are the biggest group, followed in Calvert by Europeans, and followed in Charles and St. Mary's by Latin Americans. So it varies by county.
Leslie, can I ask you a quick question to clarify on that? So the numbers on the far right, like say in St. Mary's, the 55.2%, that's of that 4.8%, right?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Correct. That's of your immigrant population as a whole. Yeah, there's another question. Go ahead.
This is a silly question. I've never heard of this. What's Oceania?
It's like Tahiti.
Gotcha.
Tahiti,
So
Bora Bora, the little tiny islands in, yeah.
Thank you.
So it's kind of, it's other part of Asia, as we think about it sometimes. But the census data keeps the track of it separately, so do we. Interestingly, in St. Mary's, for example, you have Canadians. That 3.1% North America is Canada, usually. And in Calvert, the Europeans could be a mix of Eastern Europeans, but it also could be, Maryland has a lot of people who are coming from Europe who are working here in the tech industry. They could be Irish, they could be Italian or German or whatever. So it's just important to understand kind of what kind of diversity you're seeing. When you get to what languages other than English have you encountered in your work with survivors thus far? Anybody want to grab that?
I can actually. I've had people speak Nigerian. I've had people speak Spanish, and I've had people speak German and Russian.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and that kind of, that follows on the slide before. This is what the countries of origin look like for the whole state of Maryland. And what's really important here is that I can share my screen. Can you see my cursor when I do this? Oh, goody. I'm learning new tricks all the time. Anyway, the limited English, what's interesting is you have higher levels of limited English proficiency among your Korean and Vietnamese populations than you do among your Latino populations. So they're all pretty high, and then again, this is Maryland, but the number in terms of Amharic and Somali, I haven't seen other states where this percentage is so, where these numbers are so high. So this is another, so you're looking at people the people we're talking about serving today come from very diverse countries of origin. And that's fine. It's just what we're going to be talking about is kind of what's common about their legal rights and options. So as to language access, and we have lots of materials on this that we can connect you with if you want to dive deeper into this, and we have partners nationally who help programs think about how to expand their language access. But basically, providing language access is required by law enforcement, for courts, for healthcare programs, for legal and social services, anybody who's getting any federal money. And that securing language access should be an important part of your case planning, so that if you're working with somebody who speaks Amharic or who speaks Ukrainian or Russian, you want to be thinking as an advocate or an attorney about letting your courts know if you're going to court in advance, so they're not scrambling to find an interpreter. Working with local law enforcement and prosecutors to make sure they've got interpretation. And so advocacy around interpretation I think is an important part of the work. And the other thing that's important is any organization receives any federal funding. So your local police department, for example, might see federal funding for body cameras. If they receive any federal funding for anything, then the language laws apply to the whole department and everybody in it. And that's kind of how it works. And that this is the government website on language access has more resources, as do we. And when we send the follow-up, why don't we put a link to kind of our language access page that we created for the Portland training, so that they have that. So I'm going to start off talking about some of the kind of unique dynamics that immigrant survivors experience that are different from, in addition to, what you see with working with other survivors. What would you imagine might be the barriers and fears that might prevent an immigrant survivor from seeking help? What are some of the kinds of things that you're hearing or experiencing? You can unmute yourselves and join in or chat, type in the chat. Anybody? Somebody want to volunteer to jump in and try?
Yeah, I'm looking. So we've got being reported, deportation, terrified of the police. Those are the three things that people are mentioning right now.
Okay, exactly. So we've got the major challenges. This is based on like social science research we've done nationally. Fear of deportation is absolutely number one. For immigrant victims, they don't know necessarily that your program won't turn them in. So it's really important to figure out how to do the work so that people understand that your doors are open, and that we also know with immigrant survivors that advocates and attorneys and social workers, healthcare providers are the key kind of navigators to help people be willing to access and trust the system. So fear of deportation, language access, retaliation from the abuser, fear of losing children. People have been told by their abusers, you know, I'm the citizen, you're not. If you report this, I'm going to end up with kids and you're never going to see them again. I mean, those kinds of threats. And then, you know, the other issue is the ability to kind of lack of knowledge about their legal rights and feeling kind of stuck in what kind of, you know, what's available to them, and not knowing who to trust. And we can all play a big role in that. This was actually social science data, the first part of this, that we took to Congress when we wrote the Violence Against Women Act immigration provisions. What we found was that when a citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse had the power under immigration law to file papers for their family, you know, their spouse or their children, if the spouse was an abuser, almost over 70% of the time he never filed. And he would hold that over the victim's head as a way to control her. And even in the cases where they filed, they waited a mean period of like 4 years. So they used it as power and control even when they ultimately file. And we see these kind of, I'm not going to file your papers, I'm going to withdraw your papers, I'm going to turn you into DHS if you don't do what I tell you. That kind of dynamic occurs in about is reported by 65% of immigrant survivors nationally. And we also find that this power and control and the abuse rate in immigrant families jumps when US citizens are married to foreign-born spouses or have foreign-born partners. And they jump to almost twice as the national average. The other thing that we see is that this immigration-related abuse, power, and control is kind of a lethality factor. What I mean by that is that it coexists with physical or sexual abuse, or it predicts escalation to physical or sexual abuse in an emotionally abusive relationship. It corroborates the existence. So it doesn't, these immigration-related threats don't randomly happen in emotionally abusive relationships. They usually coexist. When I train judges, I like to tell them it's like that cut telephone cord. In the old days when we were all learning domestic violence work in the 80s, when there were phones with cords, that perpetrators would cut the cord and that be corroborating evidence of the abuse. Immigration-related threats, power and control is like that. The other thing that's important to understand is that in immigrant families, there's a grave risk of, high risk of sexual assault, particularly in families that have been torn apart and reinstituted or reformed as a result of immigration, with immigrant girls having twice the likelihood of having suffered sexual assault by high school than US-born girls. So it's something that as service providers, and I'm thinking each of you who are doing work with prenatal care and you know, in the healthcare setting for girls and women, it's something you want to be aware of and look for, that people may have histories of sexual assault from childhood, particularly if they immigrated as young girls. So the other thing that's really important is that immigrant perpetrators of abuse against immigrant victims, even when the victims like file for immigration relief, are actively involved in trying to get victims removed. If the victim is taking steps to try to deal with the abuse, move out on her own, be safe, one of the key ways they retaliate is immigration-related abuse. So it's something to be aware of. And it's because of this that the immigration laws we'll be talking about include something called VAWA Confidentiality, which is not, it basically protections that bar the Department of Homeland Security from relying upon tips, like the perpetrator calls up and says, go pick up my spouse here. They can't rely on tips from perpetrators to harm victims. They can't use that information in their immigration case. They can't use it to pick up and deport people. But this, and there's real like sanctions. There's job sanctions and fines of government officials who violate this law. The problem is that until a victim files a VAWA self-petition, an immigration case that is protected by VAWA confidentiality, DHS will not claim they know. They don't have any way of absolutely knowing this is a victim. When somebody files an immigration case that is protected, VAWA puts that case, because of VAWA, that case is put in a red flag system so that the government enforcement officials know that somebody's calling about a victim so that they don't react. VAWA confidentiality also protects the case file information. So it's victims can live with their abusers and confidentially file the immigration case and choose maybe not to leave until they get work authorization, which could be a period of 3 months to 6 years, depending on which case they file. And the system was designed that way. There are also protected locations. All of your programs would be considered protected locations. This means that ICE is not, immigration enforcement is not supposed to be showing up at any of these cases looking for victims. So victims have protections when they're getting services from any of these programs, and they have protection anytime they can't be arrested at a courthouse in connection with any kind of a case related to domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or child abuse or trafficking. This I already told you about. This is the computer system that the cases go in at the Department of Homeland Security once a case gets filed. So best practices for attorneys and advocates in working with victims is to try to identify and create an environment where victims might be willing to tell you that they're undocumented, so that if you identify them as victims of domestic or sexual violence or child abuse or trafficking, if they feel comfortable enough to reveal to you that they might have an immigration issue, trying to address that as early as possible is really helpful. And that, let's say you identify a survivor and she's going to be applying for one of the forms of immigration relief I'm going to be talking about in a minute, like VAWA or U or T visa. If you as advocates give her a letter that say, she's a victim of domestic violence, we're working with her, she's in the process of filing VAWA or U visa, That letter, legally, according to DHS policies, stops enforcement officials in their tracks from going after the victim. They're not supposed to be pursuing somebody the moment they know she's in the process of filing. Now, VAWA self-petitioners, as a matter of law, all that should happen is anybody whose abuser is their spouse. These VAWA confidentiality laws apply the moment they know there's a marriage and there's abuse. The problem is, as a practical matter, getting immigration officials to actually stop pursuing somebody without the piece of paper in front of them is hard to do. So it's a good practice to give somebody a piece of paper so that you can, and then call us immediately, because we do a lot of the national technical assistance around these issues if you have a survivor who succeeded in getting immigration enforcement to go after the victim. The other thing that's important about these laws to know is that there are other places. So those of you, the family lawyers particularly, and advocates who are helping victims try to figure out how can we safely do visitation exchange? How can we exchange kids? What are locations? I've got a perpetrator who's threatening to get her deported. Where can the victim, where can they exchange the kids where immigration enforcement cannot be? And this is the policy at ICE and Border Patrol for where they can't do immigration enforcement unless they're going after somebody who's a known terrorist. So it's really very limited at sections. So these are safe locations in addition to places like your programs and others that are safe because of our confidentiality. So now what I'm going to do is like walk you through, again, big picture, how to recognize who might qualify for which forms of immigration relief. But before we do that, how does filing for immigration help? How do you think immigration relief, how do you think that might help the survivor of domestic or sexual violence or child abuse or trafficking that you're working with? What do you think the benefits of that are? And you could put it in the chat or raise your hand and talk, whichever you'd like. Anybody? Some of the benefits? Gives them hope that change is possible, absolutely. Other ideas? Our hands are getting tired. Thank you. Okay, so let me go to the next slide if I can. So some of the biggest protections are protection from deportation. And that protection from deportation actually comes from the VAWA confidentiality law I was talking about a few minutes ago. They can include their family members in their applications. So if they have an undocumented child, let's say they have 3 children and 2 were born abroad and 1 was born in the United States. The 2 children who were born abroad, the survivor can include in their application. For those of you, and again, I'm thinking Paige for you because you're working in healthcare, you may encounter cases where the child's abused and not the parent. If the parent doesn't have to be abused to qualify for these forms of relief, they qualify if they've got a child who's abused, who they're willing to come forward with and reveal the abuse and seek help. So it's a parent, so a non-abused or an abused parent can file on their own behalf or on their child's behalf. It works both ways. They get access to legal immigration status. They're on a path to that, and they're on a path to getting legal work authorization, a federally recognized ID, and greater access to state and federal public benefits, where I'm going to spend a lot of the presentation today. But it's important to understand the different immigration relief types because each type comes with different benefits. And so in order to understand the benefits, you have to at least know what the victim qualified for or has applied for. So can you raise your hands? You don't have to, if you're on camera, you can raise your hands. How many of you worked with a victim where a child or a victim where the abuser is a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse, a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident parent, or an over 21-year-old citizen child? Yeah, great. You see some hands. Exactly. So that's how you recognize whether somebody's eligible for a VAWA self-petition. So if you've got an immigrant who is, their abusers, their citizen or lawful permanent resident, spouse, parent, or over 21-year-old citizen child, and that includes step parents, and it includes former spouses. So former spouses, you have about 2 years to file. That's a VAWA, that's a Violence Against Women Act self-petition, and that's how you recognize it. It's pretty straightforward. An immigrant, you have abuse, and that abuse is defined, and I'll show you in a minute, as battering or extreme cruelty. So it includes anybody who would qualify under the domestic violence or child abuse laws in Maryland, and people who who have abuse that hasn't reached that level, and I'll show you what the list looks like. In addition, the next form of relief is something called a U visa. That's a crime victim visa, and that helps people who either are not married to their citizen boyfriend or the citizen father of the child, or the abuser is not a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. The abuser is a visa holder or undocumented, or it doesn't matter what the status is in the U visa cases. I'll go through those in a minute. But those are basically crime victim cases, and those are the broadest groups of abuse, types of abuse. It covers many types of abuse that go beyond, or violence that go beyond, or victimization that go beyond domestic and sexual violence, child abuse, trafficking. Trafficking victims have three forms of relief. They can either file for a U visa, they can file for a trafficking victim visa, and then they can file for continued presence. Gwen?
We have a question in the chat. Weird question. Has VAWA been reauthorized?
It has not, but for immigration relief, the fact that the immigration provisions, the reauthorization has no effect on whether or not there's the immigration laws that were built into a VAWA over the years change. So it reauthorizes funding for programs, but makes no changes in existing law. The fact that it has been reauthorized doesn't impact the laws that we are talking about today. Hopefully that clarifies the question. Please ask a follow-up if you have another one. Special SIJS is called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, and that helps basically any child abused by either of their parents, one or both parents. That's the easiest way to think about it. And that one is anywhere in the world. So if you are working with a child or a young person who was abused so you have to file for special immigrant juvenile status by the age of 18 or 21. I think it's 21 in Maryland. And so if you're working with a young person who has a history of child abuse by one of their parents, and that happened 10 years ago in their home country, they're still eligible for SIJS. So that's a very important remedy as well. And so I'm going to go through them quickly with a little more information. But before I do that, this is the whole list of all the different kinds of crime victimization that all of those forms of relief collectively address. So if you have people who suffered any of these forms of abuse or violence, they could qualify for one of these forms of immigration relief. And I'll go through and this is basically this section here. Where's my cursor? Is my cursor not working? There we go. Oops, it moved the slide. Okay, this part here, all of this is U visa. This is special immigrant juvenile status. And T visa is essentially the trafficking piece. It's kind of how to think about it. Okay. So to address these forms of relief and to address what you saw about perpetrators trying to use the victim's immigration status, Congress over time created all of those different forms of relief to give victims access to safety, but also to improve the ability of law enforcement and prosecutors to prosecute perpetrators and to hold people accountable and keep communities safe. So let's go through quickly each of the forms of relief. This is the VAWA self-petition. Again, it's for somebody who's been abused by a parent, a step-parent, a spouse, a former spouse. If you have to file within 2 years of divorce, if you encounter a victim where it's more than 2 years of divorce, she can't self-petition, but there's a deportation defense available that has no time limit. They have to be in a good faith marriage, which basically means it's a real marriage. You know, anytime they live together, they have children together, those kinds of things, you'll have a valid marriage. And we have whole chapters on this in the material we've given you. So the cancellation of removal is the defense in immigration court. And then the battered spouse waiver, I see your hand, I'll be right there. The battered spouse waiver is sometimes the perpetrator will file an immigration case for the victim, and then the victim will come in and say, I have to stay with my perpetrator for 2 years, or I can't get my green card, my full green card. There's a waiver for that that doesn't require victims to stay, and that's called the battered spouse waiver. Yes, you had a question. You're muted.
Yeah, so I do have a question. So we all know, working with sexual assault victims, that even in the United States, for citizens of the United States, it's really difficult to prosecute sexual assault. And so, like, it's difficult for our citizens. If we have an immigrant female who is claiming sexual assault, or an immigrant child who's claiming child sexual abuse by a parent, you know, from their country that they came from, what is the process? Because we can't even get it done here. I mean, how is that? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And that is exactly one of the things that in designing these forms of relief we are trying to address. So what happens is the system for both VAWA and the U visa were set up so that victims have to come for some helpfulness. So basic thing, make a police report, seek a protection order, raise the child abuse or the child sexual assault in the divorce or the custody case. Bring it to the attention of some government official, police officer, prosecutor, child welfare, adult protective services. All of those groups are okay. It doesn't require that the system respond, and it doesn't require a conviction. It doesn't require that the prosecutor decides to bring the case. So it was designed because the idea was, we understood that there was kind of a grapevine that one victim comes forward, develops a relationship with child protective services or a police department because they've made a report and they were treated well, and they began a process of getting a U visa. And then they tell their friends, you can call this officer and talk to him. And that's part of what we are trying to do. So it's not an absolute. We'll get into, so what happens is once somebody a VAWA self-petitioner has no obligation to have ever called the police or ever touched the justice system at all. A U visa victim has to offer some helpfulness to a government agency that can be the kinds of things I was talking about, and be willing to follow through unless she can show that she can't unreasonably refuse to follow through. But the unreasonable refuse takes into account trauma, danger, all the typical things that happen, and it takes all the deterrents that a sexual assault survivor might experience generally are part of what is in the regulations that they have to consider when they say, can she get her visa even though she didn't cooperate? So all of those factors are taken into account. Hopefully that's helpful. In addition, does this list look kind of sort of like something you guys have seen before? Usually has a different shape. Power and control wheel, maybe? Yeah, this was based off of the power and control wheel, and this is how under immigration law, the forms of abuse that can establish extreme cruelty so that victims can get relief for domestic violence even when the abuse hasn't reached the stage of physical or sexual abuse. So it's important to understand that that's broader than Maryland's domestic violence laws, for example, or child abuse laws. The U visa, so to qualify for a U visa, somebody has to have been helpful or being helpful or are likely to be helpful in the future. And that helpfulness is in either the detection or the investigation or the prosecution or the conviction or the sentencing. These are not ands. And so, but there has to be some level of helpfulness, and then they have to get a certification from a law enforcement official, and then ultimately they have to prove to the Department of Homeland Security that the crime that they suffered caused them substantial physical or mental abuse. And that's where medical records and mental health records and things like that, photographs, can be very useful as evidence. These are crimes, so with VAWA, the crimes have to have occurred in the United States, or it could have been, if you're working with military families, the abuse could have occurred abroad, but the perpetrator was, worked for the US government. It could have been embassy, it could be military. U visas, the crimes have to have occurred in the United States. There's a small level of some kind of crimes that could have occurred abroad, but it's very limited. The difference here, just to point out, the time to get toward work authorization, a full state, federally recognized ID is 4 to 18 months for VAWA self-petitioning, but it is 4 to 6 years for U visa. So there's a much longer wait to get the initial relief other than the VAWA confidentiality protection from deportation for U visa victims. T visa is the special visa for trafficking victims who are victims of a severe form of human trafficking, and that's both labor and sex trafficking, and that for labor or sex trafficking, somebody has to have been subject, if they're an adult, there has to be force, fraud, or coercion involved in the labor sex trafficking. There's an exemption for that, for the force, fraud, or coercion if they're under the age of 18. There's also a trauma exception if victims can't cooperate to the cooperation. They're supposed to, that's what I'm saying, they're supposed to comply with reasonable requests for helpfulness in the investigation or the prosecution of the trafficking, unless they're under 18 or unless they've suffered physical trauma that impedes their ability to cooperate. And that documentation of the physical or psychological trauma is where victim advocacy, healthcare providers, mental health providers can be incredibly helpful for trafficking victims. They also have to show that their removal from the United States would cause severe and significant extreme hardship, which is a pretty high standard, which is why when we wrote the law, and I was actually the lead lobbyist drafting it with Congress, we put trafficking in the U visa as well because it didn't have this requirement. But what the trafficking victim visas are much faster. So victims get work authorization and access to almost full federal public benefits and state within 3 to 12 months of filing. It's very fast. Special immigrant juvenile status is the last one I'm going to talk about, so I'm not overwhelming you guys. This is one for unmarried children under the age of 21 in Maryland who are victims of either abuse, abandonment, or neglect by at least one parent, not both parents. It could be both parents, it only has to be one parent. And then they have to go to state court and get a family court judge to give them some particular findings about finding about the abuse. The judge has to place them with somebody, which could be their non-abusive parent, could be foster care. And then there have to be findings that it wouldn't be in the child's best interest to be sent back to their home country. And usually that is done by a best interest of the child law in Maryland. And we could talk about that. But generally speaking, you could recognize one of these cases as somebody where the child has been abused, abandoned, or neglected as defined by Maryland law by a parent. And if you've got that, then that's enough to identify this as a case. These children have access to lawful permanent residency, work authorization, post-secondary educational grants and loans, all of that within 3 to 6 months, with 6 months to 3 years of filing, depending on the country of origin. So it's a very powerful remedy for kids, and many U visa victims who are including their children in the U visa who have that long 6-year wait to work authorization and like a 12 or 15-year wait to the visa, their kids can get, if there's child abuse happening in the same family as spouse abuse, for example, the kids can get special immigrant juvenile status and it goes much faster. So Gwen, can I pick on you to read the hypothetical? Give me a break for.
Okay, so Clara met Eduardo, a lawful permanent resident, when he came back to his hometown to visit his family in El Salvador. Eduardo started dating Clara, who was raising her 9-year-old son, Miguel. After Clara became pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl, Lupe, Eduardo decided to bring Clara, Miguel, and Lupe to the U.S. to live with him. When they arrived in the U.S., Eduardo took Clara, Miguel, and Lupe's passports and became physically and sexually abusive of Clara and abusive of Miguel, who tried to protect his mother from Eduardo's abuse. Eduardo also physically beat Lupe when he said she, quote unquote, misbehaved. Within a year following their arrival to the U.S., Eduardo forced both Clara and Miguel to work for his family's business and never pay them for their labor. One night when Miguel was 13 and Lupe was 5, Eduardo's rage led to severe beatings with a belt of Miguel and of Lupe. When Clara intervened to protect the children, Eduardo strangled her until she passed out. The neighbors called the police for help. Clara talked to the police when they arrived. The police arrested Eduardo for attempted murder and child abuse, took Clara to the hospital, and placed the children in the care of the state.
So the question I have, and you can use, where's my cursor? Don't tell me I lost my cursor, which happens with my computer sometimes. Okay, this is going to be fun. Okay, fortunately I have a laptop that has another cursor. What forms of immigration relief do you think Clara qualifies for? So can you put it in the chat box, what letters you think is right? So the choices are a U visa, a VAWA self-petition as the parent of Lupe, a T visa, or all of the above. You have some responses, Glenn? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
We have one person who has guessed D.
Okay.
Another D.
Okay. So the correct answer is D.
Yep, we had a third D coming in.
Okay, good. So Clara is a U visa victim because of the attempted murder and the abuse. Clara is a VAWA self-petitioner. So here's the interesting thing. If Clara and Miguel were married, no, Clara and Eduardo were married. She wouldn't marry her son. Clara and Eduardo were married. Then she'd be a VAWA self-petitioner because of the domestic violence to herself. But that fact wasn't in the evidence. So if they're not married, she can self-petition as the mother of Lupe, who is the daughter of a lawful permanent resident. And she's a T visa victim because he made her work for the family business and didn't pay her. So that's how it plays out in life. So now let's look at the kids, the kids. Oops, what happened? Why did my screen go away? That's not gonna go back up. No, okay. So what forms of immigration relief does Miguel qualify for? So is it A,
I think we're seeing your entire screen rather than just the slides.
That's weird. Okay. Hold on. How do I do this?
I think that works if you start
I don't have a cursor, so I have to kind of go over here. Is that better?
Yep, there you go.
Okay. I don't know what I hit, but okay. So does Miguel qualify for a VAWA self-petition, a U visa, a T visa, or both the T and U visa? People have ideas in the chat? Okay. So
we have A and B. Guesses A and B.
Okay. So absolutely, Miguel qualifies for a U visa because of the belt incident for sure, and the abuse of Miguel by Eduardo. He cannot self-petition because there's no marriage between, because Eduardo is not a step parent. If he was the step parent, he could self-petition. And he qualifies for a T visa because he was forced to work along with his mother. So child labor trafficking counts. So that's what it looks like. So to give you an idea of how the facts are going to play out in these cases so you can recognize it. So now what we're going to do, what happened? Can you see my screen? Did I mess it up?
It's the same thing that happened last time.
That's what I thought. Sorry, guys. Hold on. I hit the wrong key on my keyboard, and so now I have to come back and try to see. Okay. Okay, these are the ones I have to use. Okay, this works. Okay, so now we're going to spend kind of the rest of the time kind of diving into what kinds of benefits and services immigrant survivors are eligible for. And we're going to start with what everybody's eligible for if they never file for one of these forms of relief. And then we're going to end towards the latter part. We're going to talk about if they file for one of these forms of relief, what happens in Maryland in terms of what additionally they can access. So both documented and undocumented victims can access all of these forms of relief. They can get legal services, which I'll talk about in a little more detail. They can go to family court. They can call the police for help. They can get protection orders. They can file for benefits, even if they're undocumented. They can go in and file for benefits that their children qualify for because their children may be citizens. They can get shelter. They can get transitional housing. They can get WIC. They can get primary school and secondary school education, emergency Medicare, and I'm going to talk about what that includes in these COVID days. And they can get anything that VOCA offers without regard to immigration status. They can additionally get a whole list of services that are in-kind services that are necessary to protect health and safety, and I'll give you that list in a minute, I think. And then they can get school lunch programs, treatment for diseases, etc. And here's the list of in-kind services necessary that are considered necessary to protect health and safety. So it includes child and adult protective services, counseling, violence prevention, victim assistance, treatment for mental illness and substance abuse that's necessary to protect life and safety. If there's a hurricane or a flood, they can get emergency disaster relief. They can go to soup kitchens, community food banks, emergency shelter, transitional housing, and nutrition programs that are necessary to protect for those requiring special assistance. As I said, they can go in to apply for public benefits for their children that they qualify for. And no questions can legally be asked by the benefits providers in the state about the parent's immigration status or social security number. They can only ask the status of the person seeking money for themselves. So if a mother is going in and seeking money for her 2 citizen kids, but not seeking any part of TANF, let's say for herself, they can't ask social security or immigration questions about the mother. But benefits providers don't often know those things. And that's why one of the things that's really important is that we're giving you a whole set of tools so that you as victim advocates can easily figure out not only what somebody qualifies for, but can click on some links and actually get the government document or the law that says that this victim qualifies. So you can print it out and take it with you and when you're accompanying a victim applying for benefits for herself and her children. And it's also really important because many immigrants who are applying for VAWA or U visa or VAWA or T visa will qualify for public benefits in Maryland, various different kinds of benefits, healthcare in particular. And it's important for they're going to need help proving to the benefits provider or the hospital that they qualify. And so how do you figure that out? So we have a public benefits map. Now I'm going to see if I can do this. See if I can do this. Where's my cursor? There we go. So this is what our map looks like online. So it's an online public benefits map, and let's just go to, you can see all the different benefits we deal with. And so let's just go to Medicaid, and you hit go to the map. We're live actually on the internet right now. And you will get to a map that looks like this for Medicaid. And if you go to Maryland, you hit Maryland, you will get a list at the bottom of the page that shows you that depending on what form of immigration relief your victim is pursuing, what she's eligible for. And so if it says she's eligible, or let's take VAWA self-petition where it says eligible for full coverage with conditions, and you want to know what those conditions are, you can go down here to the Maryland Public Benefits map chart. And this is what our, by the way, this is our web library. We can see all the topics we have materials for you on. We'll send you the link. Go to the benefits chart, you click here, and you get a massive document where you can see the details of each kind of relief and each victim who qualifies for by all the different kinds of public benefits. And what's really exciting is, this is what law students and me like to do. Hold on one second. Is all of this. For each thing, you click on the footnote and you get the source and you get the link so that you can go to the benefits office and take the material with you, and they can see that you're right, she qualifies for it. Any questions about that? No? Okay. So now I'm going to go back to my presentation, hopefully. PowerPoint. Using my cursor in the middle of all this is fun. Okay, great. So these are all the benefits. I showed it to you live. We also have created a tool for Maryland, so you can have this in hard copy at your desk and look up who qualifies for what. It's a summary of what's on the map. So it's an additional tool that we created for you. In addition, for those of you working in health or from a healthcare perspective, we have all these other charts where you can look up Maryland and see how victims get prenatal care covered by immigration status, forensic exams, emergency medical care, and VOCA assistance. So I have another poll. What would you want to take with you if you were going to go to a public benefits agency to assist a victim? A copy of the federal statute and federal and state benefit statute that governs victims' eligibility, the DHS document that shows, let's say, so if you file a U visa or a VAWA self-petition, you get a form back from DHS saying, you know, a prima facie determination or something like that. And so you can take that piece of paper proves that that victim is a VAWA self-petitioner eligible for benefits. And then you may also want to take, you could also take the relevant state policies, federal state policies, a copy with you, or all of the above. So any responses, Gwen?
Yeah, we had a flood in of D, and then a quick note on one of the answers that only because it is better to have too much information.
Absolutely right. It is D, and it's always better to have too much information, especially here. And if you're, if you're confused and you're using the materials or you're trying to make sure what do you want to take with you and you have a question, we have a hotline, a number that you can call, and we get back within 24 hours. Our students man and woman that line, and we can help you if you need assistance. So that's the resources that we have. So as to legal service, I'm going to quickly go through a variety of different benefits and give you a little bit more detail. As to legal services, I don't know like whether the program, if there are programs in your counties that have legal services corporation funding, but the rules that govern them, if they do, is there are anti-abuse laws that basically say, in the old days, like not so old days, but in the 96, it became harder for immigrants to get legal services assistance. And then over the years, Congress restored all that legal services access for crime victims. And so if the program that is serving, if a victim is going to a program, a legal services corporation funded legal services agency for assistance, and they are a victim of any of these things, domestic violence, child abuse, sexual assault, human trafficking, elder abuse, or any of that long list on visa criminal activities I showed you, they are eligible for anti-abuse law, under anti-abuse laws, for representation by the legal services agency. And that legal services agency representation is for things that are, it's limited to something that's necessary, that's related to the abuse. But what's related to the abuse is defined really broadly, but also as victims gain the ability, because they filed an immigration case, to file for lawful permanent residency, they then get legal services access for more. And so what's important to understand is a victim can go to legal services just for the protection order. They don't have to go for an immigration case. So they can get immigration assistance, but they can get any other kind of assistance that's needed to overcome the abuse as well. And related legal assistance is very broadly defined as to anything related to ameliorating the effects of abuse, escaping the abuse, where there's a connection of some sort with the abuse. As to health care, where can immigrant survivors go to get subsidized health care who don't without regard to their whether or not they have legal immigration status? Does anybody know? Any answers? Where in your community could you go to get health care if you are undocumented? You want to take a guess? Anything in the chat, Gwen?
We have health department.
Yes.
Hospital, health department.
Okay. So those are kind of, they're right in that emergency Medicaid from a hospital is available to anybody without regard to immigration status, but all your community and migrant health clinics are also, your health services from your public health department are absolutely open to everyone, and community and migrant health clinics. And you can go to these links on the HHS website, put in the victim zip code, and it'll tell you where she can go, or he can go. This is what, we have to check this, Gwen. This is what the webpage used to look like at HHS. I don't know if they've changed it recently, but you go to their website and you find where it says find a health center. And that's where you get to the thing where you put the zip code in. There's also certain facilities, hospitals that were funded by Hill-Burton that are obligated to provide services, and you can check to see if you have any of those in your communities as well. And these federally qualified health centers do a lot of stuff. They do primary care, they provide post-assault health care, prenatal care, all kinds of fairly robust services in terms of health care that are available free of charge to anybody who's low income and uninsured, and without regard to immigration status. Emergency Medicaid is also available to anybody who has an injury or a health condition that places the patient's health in serious jeopardy, serious impairment of a bodily organ or dysfunction. And it has been determined that emergency Medicaid covers not only COVID-19 treatment, COVID-19 testing, but all the treatment. The other major thing that it covers is childbirth. So a victim, who needs childbirth is eligible to have it covered by emergency Medicaid without regard to the victim's immigration status. In addition, this is more detail about the COVID-19 laws and related laws, the CARES Act and healthcare access information that we have. Some immigrant survivors will be eligible not only for healthcare through emergency Medicaid related to COVID, but also be eligible if any victim you work with who has legal work authorization and a social security number and has filed taxes would be eligible for the rebate if they file 2019 taxes by 4 October. And they also, if they have, there's also CARES Act related unemployment insurance that victims with legal work authorization, and again, many of the victims you work with who've been here for a long time, might be lawful permanent residents. There's all kinds of people who might have legal work authorization, or might be able to get legal work authorization. Let's say you have a victim who comes in tomorrow and she's abused by her citizen husband. Within 3 months or 4 months of filing her VAWA self-petition, she will get legal work authorization and a work authorized Social Security number, and can then work. And then if she ends up eligible for unemployment, she gets, she can get the unemployment benefits, including the COVID-related ones. So next I'm going to go to transitional housing. Have any of you worked with a survivor, immigrant survivor, who was turned away from a transitional housing program? And if so, do you know why? What they were told? Does that happen to any of you? So I'm seeing, you can shake your head. I saw one no. A no is a good answer. It could be, so what happens is all of these, as a matter of federal law, and through a joint statement of HUD, DOJ, and HHS that is still current law, and actually this has been law since the Bush administration, immigrants can access, immigrant victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, human trafficking, child abuse, any U visa criminal activity, plus homeless, runaway, and abandoned children, can all access both emergency shelter and transitional housing with no restrictions at all related to immigration status or income or anything. And that includes rapid rehousing, and that programs that receive money from HUD, DOJ, or HHS must not be turning immigrants away. If they funding from all of these types of programs, also covers transitional housing for immigrant survivors, including the emergency solutions grants and continuum care programs. And this is a fuller list of all of the different kinds of programs that the different sources of money programs can use to provide transitional housing to all victims, including immigrant victims. And that there are anti-discrimination provisions that come with this. I'm telling you, I spend so much time on this because there are places around the country, including other places in Maryland, where transitional housing programs are turning immigrant victims away. So this is the law, and we have materials on these. It should become an issue. And so access to public benefits grows as immigrant children and victims begin to, so all of the things I just talked about up until this point, everybody can get, and they never have to file an immigration case. So there's a lot of support and services for victims that's federal funded or state funded or local funded that is available without restrictions. Now I'm going to turn and talk about when they begin to file for immigration relief, what victims additionally get. So what happens is under immigration law, people who are considered under public benefits laws where they intersection with immigration, public benefits laws, if somebody's a qualified immigrant, they can begin getting additional federal and state public benefits that undocumented victims don't qualify for. And the people who are qualified immigrants are anytime that somebody's a lawful permanent resident. So you can have somebody who filed for a U visa in 2007 who is now a lawful permanent resident. You can have a child who filed for special immigrant juvenile status a year ago who now has lawful permanent residency. But it also could be VAWA self-petitioners are qualified immigrants 3 months after filing. So they become qualified immigrants very early. Trafficking victims can become qualified immigrants 3 or 4 months after filing, maybe 6. But if they get continued presence, they immediately qualify for benefits while they're waiting to qualify under the T visa program. The people who generally are not eligible for benefits are asylum applicants, DACA recipients, U visa applicants and U visa holders, people on student and work visas, and the undocumented. Hold on. Okay. So what programs have immigrant restrictions? When will a program have an immigrant restriction, or when do you have to be a qualified immigrant to get benefits? So which public benefits and services an immigrant victim can access depends on their immigration status. So are they a U visa, a VAWA self-petition? Do they have lawful permanent residency? Are they filing a T visa? That all matters because the answer is different depending on that. It's also important when they enter the United States. So some of you could be working, and I'm thinking again, Paige, I'm sorry, I'm picking on you, I'm not meaning to, but in the healthcare environment, you could encounter young people who came to the US when they were 2. Let me think, can't do the math. How long ago was 1996? 96, 24 years ago? 24 years ago, I think, yeah. So somebody who came in 96, before 90, or actually came to the US in 96 and before August 22nd, 1997, it could be eligible, once they file for immigration relief, they could be directly eligible for benefits with no 5-year bar. So immigrants who've been here a long time, and they don't have to be a long time with status, they just have to be here a long time. If you're working with people, they might directly qualify in the bars so that when they enter the United States can be a factor. Usually you run into it with younger people and with old people, both ends of the spectrum. Whether they meet the program requirements, so the hardest ones are TANF, SSI, food stamps, things like that. I'll walk through that. And what benefits are offered at the state level, which is why we have the map. So the only things that are considered federal or state public benefits are payments made directly to an individual, a household, or an eligibility unit. So when a shelter receives federal funding, or when a healthcare center receives federal funding, it does not have immigrant restrictions because those payments are going to the shelter, they're going to the landlord, they're going to the program, not an individual. So the immigrant restrictions are tied to payments to an individual, household, or family. The kinds of things that are considered federal and actually state public benefits are grants, contracts, driver's licenses, welfare benefits, healthcare, disability, retirement, school, education, housing, food stamps, unemployment. The list of people who are qualified for these programs in some way or another is this, and it's quite broad. So you might be, and Maryland has its share of refugees and asylees, so you might be working with refugees and asylees, lawful permanent residents, trafficking victims, and people who are battered or subject to extreme cruelty by the U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, spouse, or parent, which includes the VAWA self-petitioners, but it could also include somebody whose husband filed the paper for them, filed immigration case for them. And this kind of goes through, it's like a checklist that you can have in your slides of which victims will qualify for benefits kind of as qualified immigrants when. Qualified immigrants, then the question is, what do they get? And they get access to public and assisted housing, supportive housing for the elderly and disabled, post-secondary educational grants and loans, most subsidized childcare. So all childcare is open to people who are, if they're qualified immigrants. Some childcare is open even if they're not qualified immigrants, depending on who's. It's TANF-funded childcare that's most restricted. So foster care is an interesting one. So if you're working with an immigrant, let's say mother, who is taking in her niece, who out of the foster care system and has been placed with the mother. If the mother is, let's say, a victim of domestic violence because of her own relationship and qualifies and files for VAWA self-petitioning, she becomes eligible to receive foster care payments, which she wouldn't otherwise. So there's, various different kinds of things that are available under state and federal law. So which of the following groups of people would not be eligible on this list for public and assisted housing. So let's try another, lawful permanent residents and asylees and refugee recipients, VAWA self-petitioning applicants, U visa applicants, recipients, or bona fide T visa applicants. Which one do you think doesn't get public and assisted housing? Gwen? Just tell me what people are saying in the chat. No? Somebody?
I don't see anything in the chat yet.
I've stumped you. Okay, so the answer, right, your question mark, good. The answer is U visa applicants and recipients. So all of the other groups do get access to public and assisted housing, but not the U visa applicants. And so if you are working, this is a big reason. Let's say you have an immigrant victim living in public housing with her abuser, and she's married, he's a US citizen and she's married to him. The moment the U visa, she files her VAWA self-petition, she becomes legally eligible for the housing subsidies in public and assisted housing and can get the subsidy and throw him out without getting without the amount of money they receive from the government shrinking. A U visa victim who throws him out and has 2 citizen children could stay in the unit, but they will, they will shrink her subsidy because they eliminate her from the grant. That's the difference. Also means they can get on the public housing waiting lists, and they can get housing vouchers. And this is, these are the instructions essentially. These are the instructions on how to tell the public housing authority or the landlord how to verify, the public housing authority how to verify that the victim is eligible. But they're immediately eligible as soon as they file the VAWA self-petition. So benefits map again, another view of it, and you would use that to kind of figure out who would qualify. So post-secondary educational grants and loans. So now let's talk briefly about Maryland benefits. So I gave you the big picture on, so what happens is, you might be wondering on, education, TANF, healthcare, what happens with the big benefits? Those big benefits are very much state controlled, because federally, victims who apply for these VAWA T or VAWA or T visa would have, or they get lawful permanent residence, have a federal 5-year bar. And the question is, what does Maryland do during those 5 years? And so I'm going to walk you through what happens in Maryland. So as to public education in Maryland, post-secondary education, so post-secondary education grants and loans, T visa victims and VAWA victims get. But in addition, Maryland has its own, provides in-state tuition. They're exempt from paying out-of-state tuition for certain immigrant children if they attended a Maryland public high school, if their parents are paying taxes, and these are the rules to get in-state tuition in Maryland. In terms of who qualifies for TANF in Maryland, VAWA self-petitioners do about 3 months after filing. T visa victims with continued presence do. U visa victims who at the 6-year mark, 4 to 6 year mark, when they get work authorization, they'll be on a wait list, they'll qualify for TANF in Maryland. Lawful permanent resident, U visa victims, and special immigrant and juvenile status will qualify as well. But if you've never, the longer people wait to file the immigration case, the longer it takes to get access, because it's a prerequisite. TANF, childcare, everybody can get childcare, development funded childcare. TANF funded childcare will be the same list as TANF above. Food stamps, SNAP, is going to be VAWA self-petitioning children of VAWA self-petition, adults and children who file for trafficking victims for continued presence or T visas. SNAP is only available other than that to children, the disabled, or the elderly who are lawful permanent residents, which special immigrant, juvenile, and U visas would have to wait until lawful permanent residency. For U visas, that's decades. That's a long wait. But for SIJ, it's a year and a half, generally, can be up to 3. Education, I went over. I summarized. So federal education benefits, post-secondary education grants and loans, FAFSA is VAWA self-petitions, VAWA cancel, the VAWA cases in the immigration courts, continued presence, T visas, and lawful permanent residence. Mostly it's going to be the SIJS children who've gone through the process and gotten lawful permanent residency. Healthcare. This is where, okay, so here's where it starts to get a little complex. So healthcare is divided into 3 pieces. First is who, in order to purchase healthcare on the exchanges, an exchange in Maryland, under federal law, you have to have a certain immigration status. So somebody who's undocumented who wants to buy healthcare on the exchange cannot. So who can? VAWA self-petitioners, trafficking victims with continued presence or a process of applying for T visa, U visa victims who are on the wait list, meaning at year 4 to 6, SIJS children at the moment they apply. That's who gets to purchase healthcare. And then who gets subsidies. So it's the same list for CHIP. So child healthcare in Maryland up to age 21 is basically the same list. Full scope adult healthcare is VAWA self-petitioners, the trafficking victims. It's almost the same. It's the wait list. But what happens is wait list approved, and then the lawful permanent residents adults only get health care if they're pregnant. So pregnant women get health care no matter what in Maryland. But everybody else who's a lawful permanent resident, including SIJ kids and U visas, have to wait 5 years until after they become lawful permanent residents to get subsidized health care if they're adults. So it's a long wait, which is, again, why you want to identify these cases as early as possible and get people in the system. Now, I don't know how close the other thing is in Maryland, there's 2 exceptions. People who live in Montgomery County or Prince George's County have more access to subsidized health care if they're poor than other places in the state. Maryland driver's license, a non-federally recognized ID, is available to anybody who files a Maryland tax return. And undocumented immigrants can get a tax ID number and file tax returns. And then the federally recognized ID comes when the VAWA self-petition is approved, when the T visa victim gets a bona fide determination or files or gets continued presence, waitlist U visas, SIJ, it's lawful permanent residency, and DACA. And then housing, we pretty much went over. And then there's also when people get lawful permanent, so the same categories of people, predominantly the VAWA self-petitions and the T visa get access to weatherization assistance. FEMA, the emergency grants, everybody gets, but then it breaks down by status, as you can see here, depending on which program, and they all have different rules. And for those of you, it's also important to understand there's been a lot in the news about public charge. And so what's important to understand is all of these crime victims we're talking about, plus asylees, refugees, and most lawful permanent residents, visa holders, and DACA are exempt from public charge, so that they can get benefits and services without having to worry about it cutting them off from immigration. And I guess what I'll do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about our technical assistance and then take a few questions as we close the webinar. So this is where you call, like our hotline, where you can call with any kind of question you have around a case of an immigrant survivor. And then this is, as I showed you earlier, what our web library looks like, where you can get more information. So I will leave this up on the screen and take any questions that you may have had. You can type them in the chat, or you can raise your hand. I really appreciate your time and attention today. Any questions? Have I totally overwhelmed you with information? Anything else? Laura, anything you want to say in closing as our host?
Well, I just typed this, but I want to say I think this has been very helpful, very informative. I know I learned a lot, and I'm hoping that everybody did. I really think it's been great.
Thank you so much. And seriously, hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation. I very much look forward to being able to travel to Southern Maryland and maybe something live with you as a follow-up when we can all meet in person someday. In the meantime, as you're doing more of this, please don't hesitate to call us if you want further training. We're going to be offering a training for family lawyers. What's the date of that?
Yeah, so I was actually just going to send it in the chat, August 13th, 10 a.m. If you want to register, I'm sending it in the chat, and I'll send out the flyer and a follow-up email for more information.
And it is not going to be the same information we did here. There'll be you might see the same benefit slides, the 4 on Maryland, just to show people, but generally we're going to be focusing on kind of the ways that immigration issues come up in family court and how to be prepared and what types of strategies you might use, and actually some things you might do to get things like spousal support. For immigrants have more access to spousal support than everybody else does in certain circumstances because of their husbands have filed affidavits of support and promised to support them with the federal government. And we'll be talking about that and things about discovery and VAWA confidentiality and issues that come up in custody and protection order and divorce cases. So look forward to talking with you then. And let me know if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. And I hope you all have a great day and a great weekend.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to end the webinar now.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.